The morning sun barely touched the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge when trouble came knocking on Rebecca's door. She was feeding her two young children their breakfast when the heavy boots stomped across her wooden porch. Her heart sank as she recognized the footsteps. Nothing good ever came from visitors this early. Rebecca had been living in this small frontier town for 3 years now. Ever since her husband died in a mining accident, life wasn't easy for a woman alone, but she managed. She took in washing, mended clothes, and sometimes helped at the general store when they needed extra hands. Her children, little Tommy, who was 7, and baby Grace, who had just turned 4, were everything to her now. The knock came hard and demanding. Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find Constable Williams standing there with 2 other men from town. Behind them stood Reverend Hartwell, the preacher who ran the church with an iron fist. His cold eyes made Rebecca's stomach turn. "Rebecca O'Brien," the constable said in his official voice, "you need to come with us." "What for?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "I haven't done anything wrong." Reverend Hartwell stepped forward, his black coat making him look like a dark shadow. "The church's charity money is missing. $50 that was meant to help the poor families in town. Money that was in a locked box that only a few people knew about." Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. "I don't know anything about any missing money." "You cleaned the church last Tuesday," the Reverend continued. "You had access to my office. You were seen near the donation box." "I was cleaning like I always do," Rebecca protested. "Mrs. Henderson asked me to dust your office while she counted the Sunday collection. That's all I did." But she could see in their faces that they had already made up their minds. The constable stepped closer. "We searched your house yesterday, while you were at the market. Found this hidden under your floorboards." He held up a small cloth bag. Rebecca's heart nearly stopped. She had never seen it before in her life, but she could guess what was inside. "That's not mine," she whispered. "I've never seen that before. Someone must have put it there." The men exchanged looks. Reverend Hartwell shook his head sadly, but Rebecca could see the satisfaction in his eyes. "The devil's work often involves lies, my dear. This bag contains $20. Part of what was stolen," Rebecca's mind raced. $20 was more money than she had seen in months. If she had that kind of money, would she be mending torn shirts for 50 cents? Would her children be wearing clothes that were more patches than original fabric? "Please," she said, looking at each man's face, hoping to find some understanding. "I have children. I would never steal from the church, especially money meant to help people like me. You know me, I've lived here for 3 years." But that was exactly the problem. She had lived there for 3 years, and they still saw her as an outsider. Her husband Patrick had been Irish, and that was enough to make some people suspicious. After he died, those suspicions only grew. A woman alone was always suspect, especially one with an Irish name and red hair that marked her heritage. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, appeared behind the men. Her pinched face looked like she had been sucking on lemons. "I always said hiring her to clean was a mistake. These people can't be trusted. It's in their nature." Rebecca felt anger rise in her chest, but she pushed it down. Getting angry would only make things worse. "Mrs. Henderson, you've known me for 3 years. Have I ever given you reason not to trust me? Have I ever been anything but honest and hardworking?" The older woman sniffed. "A thief is always honest until they're caught." Tommy appeared beside his mother, clutching her skirt. His big eyes looked up at the men with fear. Grace was still in her high chair, but she had stopped eating and was starting to cry, sensing the tension in the room. "What's going to happen to my children?" Rebecca asked quietly. "That should have been your first thought before you decided to steal," Reverend Hartwell said coldly. The truth was, Rebecca knew exactly who had taken that money. 3 days ago she had seen young Henry Morrison, the merchant's son, stumbling out of the saloon at dawn, clearly drunk. She had also noticed him hanging around the church earlier that week when she was cleaning. Henry had gambling debts all over town, and everyone knew it except his father, who refused to see his son's problems, but who would believe her word against the Morrison family? They owned the biggest store in town and had influence. She was just a poor widow with an Irish name, Constable Williams cleared his throat. The town council met last night. They've decided on your punishment. Rebecca's blood went cold. In Frontier, towns like Cedar Ridge, justice was swift and often harsh. She had heard stories from other places, stories that made her stomach turn. You'll receive 20 lashes in the church square tomorrow morning, the constable continued. As an example, to others who might think about stealing from God's house. The room started spinning. 20 lashes could kill a person, especially someone as small as Rebecca. Even if she survived, she might never be the same. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. My children need me. I'm all they have. You should have thought of that before, Mrs. Henderson said with satisfaction. Tommy started crying, not understanding what was happening, but knowing it was something terrible. Grace's cries grew louder from her chair. Rebecca knelt down and pulled Tommy close, trying to be brave for him. It's going to be okay, she whispered to her son. Though she didn't believe it herself, the men turned to leave, their duty done. As they reached the door, Constable Williams paused. For a moment, Rebecca thought she saw doubt in his eyes. But then he straightened his shoulders and walked out without another word. Rebecca was left alone with her children and the terrible knowledge that tomorrow might be the last day of her life. She had no money for a lawyer, no family to help her, and no friends powerful enough to stand up to the church and the town council. As the door closed behind the men, Rebecca sank into her chair and held her children close. She had less than 24 hours to figure out how to save herself and protect Tommy and Grace, but in a town where her word meant nothing and her accusers held all the power, she wasn't sure if there was any hope left. The morning sun that had seemed so warm earlier now felt cold and distant, like everything else in Cedar Ridge. Rebecca looked out her window at the church steeple rising above the other buildings, and for the first time in her life it looked more like a threat than a promise of hope. Tomorrow, in front of that very church, they planned to destroy her, and there seemed to be nothing she could do to stop it. The news of Rebecca's punishment spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. By noon, everyone in town knew that the Irish widow would face 20 lashes at dawn in front of the church. Some people shook their heads in sympathy, but most nodded in agreement. Stealing from the church was the worst kind of sin, they said. Rebecca spent her remaining hours in a desperate scramble to arrange care for her children. She knocked on door after door, begging neighbors to take Tommy and Grace, at least until she recovered. If she recovered, Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 houses down, opened her door with suspicious eyes. I heard what you did, she said before Rebecca could even speak. I can't have a thief's children in my house. What would people think? The door slammed shut, leaving Rebecca standing on the porch with tears in her eyes. House after house, the answer was the same. Fear, judgment, and closed doors. Finally, old Mrs. Cooper, who lived at the edge of town, agreed to watch the children. She was nearly blind and survived on charity herself, but she had a kind heart. Bring them at sunrise, she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one saw her talking to Rebecca. I'll keep them safe as long as I can. That evening, Rebecca held her children close. Tommy kept asking why she was crying, and little Grace seemed to sense something was terribly wrong. Rebecca tried to explain in words a 7-year-old could understand. Mama has to go away for a little while, she said softly, stroking Tommy's hair. You need to be brave and take care of your sister. Are you coming back? Tommy asked, his small hand gripping hers tightly. Rebecca's heart broke. She wanted to promise him she would, but she had seen what 20 lashes could do to a person. I'm going to try my very best, she whispered. Meanwhile, across town at the saloon, a tall stranger sat in the corner nursing a whiskey. Jake Coleman had ridden into Cedar Ridge 3 days ago, looking for work and a place to rest his horse. He was a man of few words, weathered by years on the trail, with eyes that had seen too much hardship. The saloon was buzzing with talk about tomorrow's punishment. Jake listened without saying a word, his jaw tightening as he heard the details. 20 lashes for a woman, laughed one drunk cowboy. That's frontier justice for you. She's got it coming, added another. Can't have people thinking they can steal from the church and get away with it. Jake had been in enough towns to recognize the sound of a mob convinced of its own righteousness. He had also been around long enough to spot injustice when he saw it. Something about this whole situation didn't sit right with him. He had seen Rebecca around town during his 3 days there. She was always working, always busy with her children, always polite to everyone despite the cold shoulders she often received. She didn't look like a thief to him. She looked like a woman doing everything she could to survive. The next morning came too soon. The church bell rang at dawn, calling the townspeople to witness justice being served. Rebecca kissed her sleeping children goodbye, whispering prayers over them, then walked them to Mrs. Cooper's house as the sun painted. The sky pink and gold. The old woman's eyes filled with tears as she took the children inside. "I'll pray for you," she whispered to Rebecca. By the time Rebecca reached the church square, a crowd had already gathered. It seemed like the entire town had come to watch. Men, women, even some children stood in a circle around a wooden post that had been driven into the ground overnight. Reverend Hartwell stood on the church steps, his black Bible in his hands. Constable Williams waited nearby with a leather whip, looking uncomfortable but determined to do his duty. The town council members stood in a group, their faces stern and unforgiving. Jake arrived just as they were binding Rebecca's hands to the post. He stayed at the back of the crowd, his hat pulled low, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. He noticed how some people in the crowd looked away, unable to watch. He saw others lean forward with cruel excitement. Most importantly, he noticed young Henry Morrison standing with his father near the front of the crowd. The boy was pale and sweating despite the cool morning air. His hands shook, and he kept glancing at Rebecca with something that looked like guilt. Jake had seen that look before. It was the look of someone carrying a terrible secret. Reverend Hartwell raised his voice to address the crowd. "We gather here today to witness justice," he proclaimed. "This woman has stolen from the house of God, taking food from the mouths of the poor and needy. Let her punishment be a warning to all who would consider such wickedness." Rebecca stood with her back to the crowd, her wrist tied to the post. She wore her best dress, wanting to face her punishment with whatever dignity she could manage. Her red hair caught the morning light, and Jake could see her shoulders trembling. 20 lashes, the Reverend announced. "Let the punishment begin." Constable Williams stepped forward, the whip heavy in his hands. The crowd fell silent, even the excited ones suddenly realizing they were about to witness something terrible. Jake studied Henry Morrison's face as the constable raised the whip. The young man's guilt was written all over him. His father, focused on the coming spectacle, didn't notice his son's distress. The first crack of the whip split the morning air. Rebecca cried out, a sound that cut through Jake like a knife. "Son?" People in the crowd gasped, others cheered. Henry Morrison turned completely white and looked like he might be sick. Jake had made his decision. He began moving through the crowd, his tall frame cutting through the gathering like a ship through water. People stepped aside without thinking, intimidated by his presence even though he hadn't said a word. By the third lash, Rebecca's dress was torn and bloodied. Her legs gave out, but the ropes held her upright against the post. The crowd was getting uglier, some calling for more punishment, others beginning to look sick at the brutality. Jake was halfway to the front now, his hand resting on the gun at his side. Not because he planned to use it, but because sometimes the threat of violence was the only thing people understood. Henry Morrison suddenly broke away from his father and stumbled toward the edge of the crowd, his face green with sickness. Jake watched him go, filing away the information. The fourth lash fell, and Rebecca screamed. It was a sound that would haunt Jake's dreams for years to come. He had heard enough screaming in his life, had seen enough injustice, had stood by and done nothing too many times. Not today. As Constable Williams raised the whip for the fifth strike, Jake stepped out of the crowd. He didn't run or shout. He simply walked forward with the quiet confidence of a man who had made peace with whatever consequences might come. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the church square. The crowd held its breath as they noticed the tall stranger moving toward the center of their circle of judgment. Jake's boots made soft sounds in the dust as he approached the post where Rebecca hung, barely conscious. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with a cold fire that made even the bravest men step back. The constable paused, whip still raised, unsure what to do about this unexpected interruption. Reverend Hartwell frowned from his position on the church steps, and in that moment of hesitation everything was about to change. Jake's boots crunched softly on the dusty ground as he walked forward. The crowd parted around him like water, sensing something dangerous in his quiet approach. Constable Williams stood frozen with the whip raised above his head, unsure whether to continue or stop. "What do you think you're doing?" Reverend Hartwell called from the church steps, his voice sharp with authority. "This is a legal punishment carried out by the order of the town council." Jake didn't answer. He never was much for talking when actions would do. Instead, he kept walking until he stood just a few feet from where Rebecca hung against the post. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of her dress. The silence stretched like a tight rope ready to snap. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The crowd pressed closer, curious and nervous about what this stranger might do. "I said, what are you doing?" The Reverend demanded again, his face turning red with anger. Jake finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "I'm watching you torture an innocent woman." A murmur ran through the crowd. Constable Williams lowered the whip slightly, confusion written across his face. "She's not innocent. We found the stolen money in her house." "Did you?" Jake asked quietly. His pale blue eyes swept across the faces in the crowd until they landed on Henry Morrison, who was now standing far from his father, sweating despite the cool morning air. Jake had spent years reading people. Cowboys, gamblers, thieves, and honest. Folks all had tells. Henry Morrison was practically screaming his guilt to anyone who knew how to look. "The evidence was clear," Mr. Morrison called out, stepping forward to defend the proceedings. $20 was found hidden in her home. "Hidden by who?" Jake asked, still not raising his voice. The question hung in the air like smoke. Rebecca lifted her head slightly, hope flickering in her pain-filled eyes. She had been ready to die. But now someone was asking the questions she couldn't ask. Reverend Hartwell climbed down from the church steps, his black coat billowing behind him. "Stranger, you have no authority here. This woman was tried by the town council and found guilty." "Was she?" Jake turned to face the crowd. "Who saw her take the money?" Silence. "Who saw her hide it under her floorboards?" More silence. People began shifting uncomfortably. Jake walked slowly around the post, his eyes moving from face to face. "Seems like a lot of people sure about something nobody actually saw happen." Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, stepped forward with her chin raised. "The evidence speaks for itself. The money was in her house." "Money's easy to plant," Jake said simply. "Question is, who had the chance to do it?" Henry Morrison made a small sound, almost like a whimper. His father glanced at him with irritation. "Henry, stand up straight. Don't let this drifter intimidate you." But Henry couldn't stand up straight. His knees were shaking and his face had gone from pale to green. Jake watched him carefully, then spoke again. "Interesting thing about thieves," Jake said conversationally. "They usually spend what they steal pretty quick. Gambling debts don't wait." The words hit Henry like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, bumping into Mrs. Patterson, several people. In the crowd turned to look at him, starting to notice his distress. "What are you suggesting?" Mr. Morrison demanded, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Jake didn't answer directly. Instead, he walked over to Constable Williams and held out his hand. "Give me the whip." "I can't do that," the constable said, though he didn't sound entirely sure, then put it down and walk away. The two men stared at each other. Jake wasn't threatening violence, but everyone could feel the potential for it hanging in the air. The constable was a decent man who had never enjoyed this part of his job. After a long moment, he let the whip fall to the ground. Reverend Hartwell's face turned purple with rage. "This is outrageous. You have no right to interfere with our justice." "Your justice?" Jake's voice remained calm, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "You call this justice?" Whipping a woman half to death based on planted evidence? The evidence wasn't planted. Mrs. Henderson shrieked. Then where's the other $30? Jake asked. The question stopped everyone cold. They had found $20 in Rebecca's house, but $50 had been stolen. In all their righteous anger, no one had bothered to ask where the rest of the money had gone. Henry Morrison made another small sound and pressed his hand to his mouth. His father finally noticed his son's condition and frowned. Henry, what's wrong with you? You look sick. Jake watched the young man with the patience of a hunter. Guilt's a heavy burden, he said quietly. Makes a man's stomach turn, makes his hands shake. Makes him sweat even on a cool morning. You're talking nonsense, Mr. Morrison snapped, but his eyes were starting to focus on his strange behavior. Rebecca lifted her head again, her voice barely a whisper. I saw him coming out of the saloon 3 mornings ago. He looked desperate. Shut up, Henry suddenly shouted, his composure finally cracking. Just shut up. The crowd went dead silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Mr. Morrison stared at his son with growing horror. Jake nodded slowly. There it is. Henry? Mr. Morrison's voice was barely audible. Son, what did you do? The young man's face crumpled. All the guilt and fear he had been carrying for days came pouring out. I didn't mean for this to happen, he sobbed. I just needed the money. The gambling debts. They were going to hurt me if I didn't pay. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Some people looked ashamed, others angry at being deceived. Mrs. Henderson stood with her mouth hanging open, for once having nothing to say. Jake walked over to where Rebecca hung against the post and carefully began untying her hands. Her wrists were raw from the ropes and she could barely stand. Without a word, he caught her as she collapsed, lifting her gently in his arms. But the money in her house, Constable Williams said weakly. Henry was crying openly now. I put it. There, I still had $20 left, and I thought if they found it in her house, everyone would believe she was the thief. I didn't know they would do this to her. Mr. Morrison looked like he had aged 10 years and 10 seconds. His son, his pride and joy, had not only stolen from the church, but had framed an innocent woman for his crime. Reverend Hartwell tried to regain control of the situation. Well, the truth has come out. We can discuss Henry's punishment later. The important thing is that justice has been served. Jake looked at him with disgust. Justice? You nearly killed an innocent woman because you were too eager to judge her. Rebecca stirred in his arms, her voice weak but determined. My children. I need to get my children. Easy, Jake murmured, the first gentle words anyone had heard from him. We'll get your children. But first you need a doctor. As Jake carried Rebecca away from the post and toward the doctor's office, the crowd began to disperse. Some people looked ashamed of what they had witnessed. Others muttered angrily about being deceived by Henry Morrison, but Jake paid them no attention. His focus was entirely on the broken woman in his arms, the woman whose only crime had been being different, being alone, being an easy target for a town's prejudice. The morning sun was climbing higher now. But for Rebecca, the long night of injustice was finally beginning to end. Dr. Mitchell's office was small and cluttered, but it was the only medical help Cedar Ridge had. The old doctor looked up from his morning coffee when Jake kicked the door open with his boot, Rebecca unconscious in his arms. Good Lord, the doctor whispered, setting down his cup with shaking hands. Put her on the table, carefully now. Jake laid Rebecca down as gently as he could. Her torn dress revealed the angry red welts across her back where the whip had struck. Some were bleeding. Others were already starting to swell. The doctor immediately began cleaning the wounds. This is barbaric, Dr. Mitchell muttered as he worked. 20 lashes could have killed her. Jake stood silently by the window, watching the street. Word would spread quickly about what had happened in the church square. Some people would be angry that their justice had been interrupted. Others might be looking for someone to blame. She need to stay here for at least a week, the doctor said without looking up. These wounds could get infected easily. And she's lost some blood. Jake nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He counted. out enough coins to cover the doctor's fee and placed them on the desk. "I don't need your money," Dr. Mitchell said quietly. "This is my fault too. I should have spoken up when I heard what they planned to do." "Everyone should have spoken up," Jake said. His first words since entering the office. The doctor finished bandaging Rebecca's wounds and covered her with a clean blanket. "She sleep for a while. The pain and shock have exhausted her body." Jake pulled a chair over to sit beside the bed. Dr. Mitchell watched him with curious eyes. "You planning to stay here all day?" the doctor asked. "As long as it takes." "She's not your wife. Not even your friend, from what I can tell. Why do you care what happens to her?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. "I had a sister once. Different town, same kind of people. They decided she was guilty of something she didn't do. Nobody stood up for her." The doctor didn't ask what happened to Jake's sister. He could see the pain in the younger man's eyes and knew it wasn't a story with a happy ending. Around noon, Rebecca stirred awake. The first thing she saw was Jake sitting beside her bed, still as a statue. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. "My children," she whispered, trying to sit up. "Easy," Jake said, gently pressing her back down. "Doc says you need to rest." "But Tommy and Grace, they're with Mrs. Cooper. She can barely take care of herself. They must be so scared." Jake stood up. "I'll get them." "You don't understand. Mrs. Cooper lives at the edge of town. She's nearly blind and has no money. She can't feed them." "Then I'll bring food too." Rebecca stared at him through her pain. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Jake adjusted his hat and headed for the door. Sometimes that's the only reason that matters. He found Mrs. Cooper's tiny house after asking directions from a boy on the street. The old woman answered his knock with suspicious eyes, but when she saw Tommy and Grace peeking out from behind her skirt, Jake's expression softened. "You must be the man who helped their mama," Mrs. Cooper said, relaxing slightly. Tommy stepped forward, his small face serious beyond his 7 years. "Is Mama dead?" "No," Jake said, kneeling down to the boy's level. "She's hurt, but she's going to be fine." "She's with the doctor." Grace toddled over and tugged on Jake's pants leg. "Mama?" she asked in her tiny voice. Jake looked at the two children and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. They were so small, so vulnerable, and they had almost lost the only person who loved them. "Your mama's going to be okay," he told them, "but she needs to rest for a few days. Can you be brave a little longer?" Tommy nodded solemnly. Grace just sucked her thumb and stared at this tall stranger with the kind eyes. Jake reached into his saddlebags and pulled out some jerky and hardtack he had been saving. It wasn't much, but it would help. He also gave Mrs. Cooper some money from milk and bread. "I'll be back tomorrow with more food," he promised. For the next 3 days, Jake established a routine. He would sit with Rebecca during the day, leaving only to check on the children or to get supplies. At night, he slept on the floor of the doctor's office, his gun within easy reach. Dr. Mitchell had offered him a room at the boarding house, but Jake preferred to stay close. He had seen the looks on some faces when people passed by the doctor's office. Not everyone was happy about what had happened in the church square. Rebecca grew stronger each day, but the emotional wounds seemed deeper than the physical ones. She barely spoke, just stared out the window with hollow eyes. "The whole town watched," she finally said on the 3rd day. "They all believed I was guilty. They wanted to see me punished." Jake looked up from the book he had been reading. Dr. Mitchell had lent it to him, though he wasn't much of a reader. Not all of them. Enough of them. People believe what's easy to believe. Thinking takes effort. Rebecca turned to look at him. "You talk like you've seen this before." Jake set down the book. Different towns, same story. Someone needs someone to blame, and they pick whoever's easiest to target. "Is that what happened to your sister?" Jake went very still. He hadn't realized he had mentioned his sister to her. "You talked in your sleep the first night," Rebecca said softly. "You kept saying you were sorry, that you should have done something." Jake stood up and walked to the window. Outside, he could see Henry Morrison walking down the street with his head down. The young man looked like he had aged years in just a few days. She was accused of witchcraft, Jake said finally. Crazy, right? But some cattle died, and the crops failed, and people needed someone to blame. My sister was different. She read books, knew about herbs and healing. That was enough. Rebecca's heart ached for him. What happened? I was 17. Thought I was tough, thought I knew everything. But when the town council made their decision, I was too scared to stand up to them. I told myself there was nothing I could do. You were just a boy. Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. I was her brother. I was supposed to protect her. Rebecca struggled to sit up, ignoring the pain in her back. Jake, look at me. He turned, and she could see the guilt that had been eating at him for years. You can't save someone who's already gone, she said gently. But you saved me. You saved my children from losing their mother. Jake stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. It wasn't forgiveness for his past failure, but it was a start that evening. As Rebecca slept and Jake kept his vigil by her bedside, he made a silent promise. He had failed his sister, but he wouldn't fail this woman and her children. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. But inside the doctor's office, two wounded souls had found something they hadn't expected to find in each other. Not love, not yet, but understanding. And sometimes that was enough to begin healing. By the end of the first week, Rebecca was strong enough to sit up and take short walks around the doctor's office. Her physical wounds were healing, but Jake could see that something deeper was still broken inside her. She moved carefully, not just because of her injuries, but like someone who expected the world to hurt her again. Jake had been thinking during those long days of watching over her. Henry Morrison's confession had cleared Rebecca's name, but it hadn't really solved anything. The boy was walking around town free while she was still treated like an outsider. That didn't sit right with Jake. I want to go home, Rebecca said one morning, looking out the window toward her small house. Doc says you need another few days. Jake replied from his usual chair beside her bed. It's not about my back anymore. She turned to face him. I can't hide in here forever. I need to face whatever's waiting for me out there. Jake understood what she meant. Staying in the doctor's office felt safe, but it wasn't really living. And Rebecca had children who needed their mother. That afternoon, when Rebecca was napping, Jake walked over to the Morrison family store. The bell above the door rang as he entered, and Mr. Morrison looked up from behind the counter. The man had aged considerably in the past week. What do you want? Morrison asked quietly. To talk. About your son, Morrison's shoulders sagged. Henry's been sick since ... since what happened. Won't eat, barely sleeps. I don't know what to do with him. Jake looked around the well-stocked store, then back at the merchant. Your boy made a mistake, a bad one, but he's got a chance to make it right. How? The damage is done. That poor woman nearly died because of what he did. She's still alive. Her children still need food and clothes. Your son's debt caused this mess. Maybe it's time he started paying it back, Morrison frowned. I don't understand. Rebecca O'Brien needs work. Real work with fair pay. Not cleaning jobs that barely put food on the table. You want me to hire her? After what happened? Jake's voice stayed calm, but his eyes were hard. I want you to give her the respect she should have had all along. She's smart, honest, and, works harder than most people in this town. Your son's confession proved that. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. The townspeople might not like it. Some of them are still angry about being fooled. Then maybe it's time this town learned to do better. That evening, Jake helped Rebecca walk to Mrs. Cooper's house to see her children. Tommy ran to his mother the moment she appeared in the doorway, wrapping his small arms around her waist. Grace toddled over and reached up to be held. Careful with Mama's back, Jake said gently, lifting Grace so she could hug her mother without causing pain. Mrs. Cooper wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the reunion. I've been so worried about all of you. Rebecca held her children close, breathing in their familiar scent. We're going to be okay, she whispered, and for the first time in weeks, she actually believed it. The next Sunday, something unexpected happened. As the church bell rang for morning service, people began gathering as usual. But when Reverend Hartwell stepped up to the pulpit, he looked different. Older, less certain of himself, Jake had decided to attend, sitting in the back pew with his hat in his hands. He wanted to hear what the preacher would say about what had happened. "My friends," Reverend Hartwell began, his voice lacking its usual fire, "this past week has taught us all a difficult lesson about judgment and mercy." The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Many of them had been in the church square that morning, watching Rebecca suffer for a crime she didn't commit. "We were so quick to believe the worst about someone who was different from us," the preacher continued. "So eager to see justice done that we forgot about compassion and truth." Jake noticed several people looking down at their hands, unable to meet their neighbor's eyes. "The Bible tells us to bear one another's burdens, to care for the widow and the orphan. Instead, we added to their suffering. We owe Rebecca O'Brien and her children our deepest apologies." After the service, something remarkable happened. 1. By 1, people approached Rebecca outside the church. Mrs. Patterson, who had slammed her door in Rebecca's face, apologized with tears in her eyes. Other families offered help, food, and friendship. Not everyone was ready to change, but enough people were that Rebecca began to feel like she might actually have a place in Cedar Ridge after all. Mr. Morrison approached her nervously, his son Henry trailing behind him. The young man looked terrible, thin and pale with dark circles under his eyes. "Mrs. O'Brien," Morrison began awkwardly, "I wanted to offer you a job at my store, full-time, fair wages. And Henry here has something to say to you." Henry stepped forward, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to you. I was scared and desperate, and I made you pay for my mistakes. I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything, but I mean it." Rebecca looked at the young man who had nearly destroyed her life. She could see genuine remorse in his eyes, and she remembered being 19 and making mistakes of her own. "We all make choices we regret," she said quietly. "The important thing is learning from them." As the weeks passed, Rebecca settled into her new job at Morrison's store. She was good with numbers and had a way with customers that helped business. Slowly, she began to rebuild her life in Cedar Ridge. Jake had planned to move on after Rebecca recovered, as he always did. But somehow he found reasons to stay. First, he took a job helping the blacksmith. Then he rented a small room above the saloon. Before he knew it, a month had passed. Then, too, Rebecca noticed, of course. She also noticed how Tommy had started, following Jake around when he wasn't working, and how Grace would reach for him whenever she saw him. Her children, who had been so afraid of men after watching their mother's punishment, trusted Jake completely. One evening, as Jake was walking Rebecca and the children home from the store, Tommy asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Are you going to stay with us, Mr. Jake?" Jake stopped walking and looked down at the boy's hopeful face. Then he looked at Rebecca, who was trying to pretend she wasn't waiting for his answer. "I don't know," Jake said honestly. "I've been moving from town to town for a long time. It's what I do." "But why?" Tommy asked with the direct curiosity of a child. Jake was quiet for a moment. "I guess I was looking for something. Or maybe running from something. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." Rebecca shifted Grace to her other hip and looked at him carefully. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Jake met her eyes, and something passed between them that had been building for weeks. It wasn't just attraction, though, that was there too. It was understanding, respect, and the recognition that they had both been alone for too long. "Maybe I did," he said softly. That night, after the children were asleep, Jake and Rebecca sat on her front porch talking quietly. The stars were bright in the clear frontier sky, and the town was peaceful around them. "I'm scared," Rebecca admitted. "Not of you, but of hoping for something and having it taken away again." Jake nodded. "I understand. I've been running so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place." "We could figure it out together," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake reached over and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her since carrying her away from that terrible post in the church square. "I'd like that," he said Dot as they sat together in the quiet night. Two people who had been broken by life began to imagine what it might be like to be whole again. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time in years, both of them had something they had almost forgotten existed: hope.